Welcome to Delicious Discoveries. My name is Angela Perico, nutritionist at Giant. In today's Delicious Discoveries class, we're going to be talking about what makes bread rise. And the best part is we're going to learn this while making homemade bread rings. We're also going to talk about whole grains and why they're good for our bodies. Now, if you happen to miss any of our previous Delicious Discoveries classes, like those on homemade frozen yogurt, regrowing kitchen scraps, or apple donuts, no worries. We can provide you with the link to the pre-recorded class so you can perform those classes in your own time. But before we begin, does anyone know what a nutritionist is? A nutritionist is someone that knows a lot about food and how we can use it to keep our bodies strong and healthy. We also know a little bit about food science too. So not only do we know what foods are good for us, but we know why they're good for us as well. And the best part about being a nutritionist is you get to meet so many different people, like all of you here today. So thanks for joining us. Be sure to grab your parents, your materials, your thinking caps, and let's get started. Let's go through our agenda for today's Delicious Discovery. First, we're going to take a look inside our Delicious Discoveries kit to make sure we have all the materials we need for the activity. Then it's activity time. We're going to do our food science experiment, bake those bread rings, learn, and have some fun. Last, we're going to test our knowledge to see how much we learned during today's Delicious Discovery. But before we begin, let's go ahead and see what you know so far. We're going to take just a short quiz to test your knowledge on how you think bread rises. If you're worried or unsure about any of the answers, don't worry. We're going to take this quiz all over again at the end of class, so make sure you're paying attention.
Question 1. What makes bread rise? Is it water, flour, yeast, or salt? Question 2. What does yeast eat? Is it sugar, salt, oil, or sesame seeds? Question 3. What's your favorite type of bread? Sourdough, pumpkin, banana bread, or other? Question 4. Why are whole grains good for our bodies? Is it because they have fiber, because they have vitamins and minerals, because they have antioxidants, or all of the above? Question 5. Which one is not a whole grain? Is it popcorn, white rice, barley, or quinoa?
So go ahead and put your answers aside and we'll get back to them at the end of class. For now, let's grab our Delicious Discoveries kit and make sure we have all the materials to get this activity started.
Today we need whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour, and active dry yeast. We also need water, oil, and honey. Then grab whatever spices you want to season your bread rings. Materials: we need a bowl, a brush, a spoon, a baking sheet, and a pan filled with water.
Okay, so now that we have everything we need in our Delicious Discoveries kit, let's talk about what makes bread rise. Are there any guesses? The answer is yeast. Does anyone know what yeast is? Do you think yeast is alive? Yeasts are living organisms and they exist everywhere in the world around us. Now, there are many different types of yeast. Some exist on our skin, in the air, or even on the skins of fruits and vegetables like grapes. But the yeast that we are using today is active dry yeast. This is a really common yeast when it comes to baking. Now, does anyone know the scientific name for yeast? It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or sugar-eating fungus. This type of yeast is really strong and capable of fermentation. Does anyone know what fermentation is? Fermentation is what causes the dough to rise. The yeast feeds on sugar in the dough and creates something called carbon dioxide. This is fermentation. Have you ever broke open a piece of bread and looked inside? It's normally fluffy and looks like it has holes in it, right? Well, during fermentation, the carbon dioxide is actually trapped in little pockets of air that makes the appearance of holes, and this is what causes the bread dough to rise. Now, what about our yeast? What do you think happens to yeast once it's done its job? Well, remember, since yeast is a living organism, it needs the right environment to survive. Because the oven is so hot, the heat actually kills off the yeast and there's no yeast in our final product. And did you know that yeast can be used in many other recipes besides for bread? You can use yeast to make things like cake, biscuits, crackers, pretzel dough, and even beer. Okay, so now that we know why bread rises, it's time to see our discovery ourselves. It's delicious discoveries time. Now before we get started, pause here real quick and let's go wash our hands. All right, so now that our hands are nice and clean, it's time to get started with our delicious discovery. Now, feel free to pause at any point if you feel like you need a little extra time. But step number 1 is to combine water, oil, honey, and yeast, and we're going to stir to dissolve it. So one thing that's really important is we want to make sure our water is lukewarm. So if you have a food thermometer, you can go ahead and measure it. That's between 100 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason we want our water to be lukewarm is because we want the water to be warm enough so the yeast dissolves, but not too hot so that it kills our yeast. Then we have our honey. So honey is going to provide a little bit of sweetness to our bread, but it's also going to act as a sugar that the yeast can feed off of. So then we're going to add in our oil. And of course, we're going to add in our packet of yeast as well. And we're just going to stir until it all dissolves. Okay, once the yeast is dissolved, the next step is to add in our whole wheat flour and some salt. Now, one thing that's important when it comes to baking bread is we want to make sure we're getting the exact measurement of the flour. So to do that, what you do is you spoon the flour into your dry measuring cup, and you're going to spoon it, and we want to be sure not to pack it down. Then you're going to take a butter knife, and you're just going to level off the top to make sure that we have 1 cup. Then you go ahead and add that in. Then we're going to add in our 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And we're going to give this a stir and then add in some more all-purpose flour. All right, so before we add in our all-purpose flour, your dough should look something like this. It's not quite thick yet. So let's add in our all-purpose flour.
Okay, so now that we've added in our all-purpose flour, we're going to start to stir our dough. As the dough starts to thicken, you may need to switch over to your hands to start kneading the bread. To knead the dough, you're going to stretch it out. You're going to fold it over like you would if you were folding a t-shirt. You're going to press it down, then you're going to flip it and do that on the other side. So you stretch it, fold it, press it, and flip it. You're going to keep kneading the dough until it's smooth and elastic. You may need to take your dough out of the bowl and continue to knead it on a hard surface. Now once your dough starts to get smooth and elastic, you can form it into a little ball that looks something like this.
so once you're done kneading your dough, it should be smooth and elastic. We're going to transfer it to a lightly greased bowl. We're going to cover it and we're going to let our yeast do its job. We're going to let it rise for about 45 minutes or until it doubles in size. So while we wait during that 45 minutes, we're going to do our nutrition lesson. However, before we get started on that, let's preheat our oven to 400 degrees. And you're going to want to make sure to put a pan of water in the oven as well. This is going to create a little bit extra moisture in the oven to help make your bread rise while it cooks as well. So go ahead, pause real quick, preheat the oven, put your bread somewhere somewhat warm so it can rise, and then come back for our nutrition lesson. All right, so now while we wait for our bread dough to rise and we got our oven preheating, let's get into our nutrition lesson. Does anyone know what the main ingredient from our recipe today was besides for the yeast? Flour. Flour or wheat is a grain, and grains give us energy so we can learn, play, and really fuel our day. If we're looking at my plate, we see that about a quarter of our plate should be made up of grains at every meal. I think our bread rings will fit perfectly right here. Can anyone name any other grains besides for bread? Other grain foods include things like rice, pasta, crackers, cereal, oatmeal. All of those would be considered grains. So yes, we want to include a grain at every meal. But the type of grain is also really important. Does anyone know what a whole grain is? A whole grain has all three parts of the grain: the germ, the bran, and the endosperm. Whole grains provide more fiber, protein, and vitamins to keep our bodies going strong. We want to try to make at least half of our grains in the day whole grains. That's why today with our bread rings, we use half whole wheat flour, half regular flour, because whole wheat is a whole grain. Can anyone name any other whole grains? What about brown rice, whole wheat pasta, barley, quinoa, and even popcorn? All right, so hopefully you learned something new about whole grains. Now let's check on our dough and see if the yeast is doing its job. My dough is definitely starting to rise, and hopefully yours is too, but it needs a little bit more time. So let's cover it, and you can go ahead and pause here and come back in about 35 minutes or until your dough has doubled in size. Then we'll start putting together our bread rings. Welcome back. Hopefully your dough has doubled in size and we're ready to start putting together our bread rings. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our dough and we're going to divide it up into 8 equal sized pieces. Then with each piece, we're going to roll it out to about a 10 to 14 inch long piece of rope and create that bread ring. Once you have the rings, you're going to brush them with some water and add whatever seasonings you want to the top. You could do sesame seeds, maybe you want to add Old Bay, or maybe you want to go with oregano or Italian seasoning, whatever you want. So let's go ahead and get started on those bread rings. All right, so hopefully you've got your bread rings made up and seasoned. So what we're gonna do now is we're going to put these aside for 10 more minutes before we put them in the oven, just to let them rise a little bit more. So what we'll do in the meantime is we'll come back to our little quiz that we took at the beginning. Let's see how much you learned. Bread rings are finally in the oven. You all have done an awesome job. Did you have fun? Did you learn something new? I certainly hope so. Well, it's that time again, so let's pull up those questions from the beginning of class and see how much you've learned.
All right, question 1. What makes bread rise? Is it water, flour, yeast, or salt? The answer is yeast. Question 2. What does yeast eat? Is it sugar, salt, oil, or sesame seeds? The answer here is sugar. Question 3. What's your favorite type of bread? Sourdough, pumpkin, banana, or other? No right or wrong answers here. Personally, my favorite is sourdough. Question 4. Why are whole grains good for our bodies? Is it because they have fiber, because they have vitamins and minerals, because they have antioxidants, or all of the above? The answer is all of the above. Question 5. Which one is not a whole grain? Is it popcorn, white rice, barley, or quinoa? The answer is white rice.
Good work! We hope that you learned something new. Now, your grains might need a little bit more time in the oven, but I just pulled out mine and I gotta say, they look fantastic. This is about what yours should look like as well. Now, let's break open one of these rings and see if our yeast did its job. Do you see those air bubbles? That means our yeast did it. Our yeast did its job. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you had fun. Parents, teachers, and caregivers, if you enjoyed this activity with your kids, be sure to stay tuned in the upcoming year for more Delicious Discoveries classes. And even though this class was recorded, we would still love to see how much fun you and the kids had with this activity. The first 10 people to post their photos to our Healthy Living by Giant Facebook group will receive a Delicious Discoveries apron mailed directly to your house. We can't wait to see how much fun you had with this activity, so be sure to post those photos. For more information about Delicious Discoveries and our upcoming classes, be sure to check out giantfood.com/nutrition. Thanks so much and take care.